today has its descendants, brave young Iranian men and women who are willing to risk their lives on the various streets of our country, fighting for the very same freedoms that we so often take for granted here in the free world. The question remains, can Iran achieve freedom? Can we achieve that goal? Not only we will, but we must. Not only in our interest, but I think in the interest of the world. But obviously the question has always been and remains, how do we get there? There's no question that the very principles that we are aspiring to are obviously universal. I don't think the rules of the game change whether you are a citizen in Myanmar, in Caracas, or in Tehran. It remains always the same. And in that sense, I would like to first start by saying there are areas where we have to be very clear into where we stand. I, for one, am committed to a secular democratic alternative. Why do I emphasize the word secular? Because I don't believe that we can achieve democracy without a clear separation of religion from government. This has been proven time and again as a necessity and prerequisite to democratic order. It explains why in a society like America, Islam is one of the fastest growing religions, while under a so-called clerical regime in Iran, Islam is losing ground and is getting weaker and weaker by the day. It's very simple. There's freedom of religion. In Iran, there's none. These are the fundamental principles. And then it becomes a question of human rights. Do we advocate it simply as a design and slogan, or can we codify it and put the basis of our Constitution in the future on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Why? Because how else could our citizenry be guaranteed of total equality? How could our citizens be guaranteed that irrespective of ethnicity, religious belief, political view, or sexual orientation, they will never, ever be segregated or mistreated? These, I think, are the elements that as a society and as citizens of that country we must strive for. In order to achieve that goal, we have to have these principles always embedded in our desires, irrespective of our ideologies, irrespective of our thinking, for the collective good of our nation, if we truly want to have a pluralistic democratic society. Now, I also believe that it is not only sufficient to simply rely on the apparatus of states, or for that matter, a legal document like the Constitution. It takes much more to achieve and stabilize a country under these principles, in a sense that society has to also be proactive well beyond the structure of government, which is why I wanted to spend most of my time on the subject of how critical the role of civil society is in any country in order to not only institutionalize democracy, but the safeguard of democracy and human rights. As such, again, I think that a proactive society will be much more likely to expedite the process of its implementation and its safeguard. And as such, I think the topic that I wanted to use this limited time to focus on, beyond the obvious, which I think we all talk about the same issues, is what are these rules? Not only at this phase, but in the future, and also finish by pointing to some role that I believe the international community can have. When we look at today's dynamics of change in Iran, we talk about the Green Movement, for instance, we talk about a number of entities within Iran, outside government, of course, NGOs and civil society. You will realize that, in fact, the most effective elements that have proven to push the agenda of freedom in Iran forward have mostly been elements that, in fact, belong to Iranian civil society, albeit severely restrained and restricted. Nevertheless, it is as a result of their efforts that the sustenance of this movement was so far possible. And in that sense, I believe that much needs to be further invested in that, to give them more measures and more instruments to achieve their goals. As one of the panelists referred recently, he said it's not so much that they expect guidance from us, but they expect our support. I want to use a few practical examples to give you an idea of where I think, for instance, we could be effective. I've always been wondering that while the world has been limiting its focus on how to bring pressure on the Islamic regime, for instance, in the context of using economic sanctions against the current government. Is this necessarily sufficient? Is it sufficient to simply have a policy of sanctions while you maintain the political status quo in mind? Using the South African example, I will tell you that the reason the sanctions were effective was because at the end, the goal was to put an end to apartheid. You cannot have an effective sanction policy without having an alternative in mind. Sanctions cannot be an end, it may be a means to that end. And then I would argue that the better leverage you have against the regime is the force of the people, much more than external economic pressures. Because while you may harm the regime, you do